They didn't think I'd actually do it. That's the part that still finds me at odd hours. Not the betrayal itself, not the arithmetic of what they wanted, but the flat, untroubled certainty in their faces. They stood beneath balloons they had paid for with money I had given them, in a room they had rented for the purpose of honoring me. And they looked at me the way a man looks at a vending machine that has always, without fail, dispensed what he selected. There was no malice in it. That was the terrible part. Malice would have been a kind of respect. Malice would have meant they considered me a person capable of resistance. 62 years I had lived by then, and it took every one of them to teach me a thing I could have learned in an afternoon if I had been braver. That the people who love you most are often the ones best positioned to make you feel like nothing at all, and they will do it while smiling, and they will believe they are being kind. Before I take you back through all of it, and I intend to take you through all of it, the loans that were not loans, the letter my wife left behind, the lawyer who tried to prove I had lost my mind, the question my grandson asked me that I will carry to my grave, let me ask you something small. If stories about ordinary people, finding the edge of themselves late in life, are the kind of thing that keeps you company, consider subscribing to my channel. I tell these the only way I know how. Slowly and true. That's all. Now let me tell you what happened. I spent 34 years as a civil engineer for the city of Cedar Falls, Iowa. I began as a surveyor's assistant with $40 in a checking account and a pair of boots that took on water when it rained. And I ended as deputy director of infrastructure planning, which is a long title for a man who spent most of his career worrying about where water goes when nobody is watching. I mention this not to impress you. I mention it because everything I built, the pension, the house, the modest and unglamorous pile of it, was built one municipal drainage plan at a time. And because that pile is what my daughter and her husband came to believe, was theirs by a kind of natural law, the way rain belongs to the ground. My wife's name was Margaret. She taught kindergarten for 26 years at a school on the east side, where the heating never worked right, and she came home most winters with a cough she refused to acknowledge. She had a way of listening that made you talk longer than you meant to. She left notes in my lunch, little squares of paper with nothing much written on them. Don't forget your good pen. Tuesday is trash. I love you, engineer. And she thought I never noticed that whenever we split anything, an apple, a sandwich, the last of the coffee, she took the smaller half. I noticed every single time, 31 years, and I never once said so. I have thought about that a great deal since. There are silences that keep the peace and silences that quietly rot the floorboards, and it takes most of a life to learn which is which. Breast cancer took her. Caught late, gone in 14 months. She spent the last of those months apologizing to me for the inconvenience, which is the single, most Margaret thing that has ever happened. After she was gone, there was only Claire. Claire was 34 when her mother died, living 40 minutes away in a subdivision where all the mailboxes matched. She called on Sundays. She brought the children on holidays. For the first 2 years of my widowhood, she was, without exaggeration, the reason I got out of bed, not because she demanded it, but because she'd show up on a Saturday with 2 coffees and sit on my back porch and say nothing for an hour, which is the highest form of love available to people who are bad at talking. She had her mother's habit of listening. She had her mother's hands. Then she married Nathan Voss. I want to be fair to Nathan, because fairness has always mattered to me, more than it has been good for me. He was not a bad man in any of the obvious ways. He never raised his voice. He never drank. He never said a cruel thing in my hearing in 11 years. He was the other kind, the patient kind, the kind who smiles while he is quietly determining what you're worth, and who is genuinely surprised and genuinely hurt when you object to being appraised. He sold commercial insurance. He was extraordinarily good at it, because he had mastered the central art of that profession, which is making a person feel that you are doing them a favor by removing something from them. The first time I saw him clearly was at Margaret's funeral, and I have never told anyone this. During the reception at the house, while people ate ham off paper plates and told me things about my wife that I already knew, I came around the corner into the hallway and found Nathan standing in front of the built-in bookcase my father had made, running his hand along the joinery. He didn't hear me, he was assessing it. Not admiring, assessing. There is a difference in a man's face between those two things, and I saw it, and I told myself I was a grieving man imagining things. I have replayed that hallway 10,000 times. The calls began about 2 years after the wedding. Claire called me on a Tuesday, which was unusual. Sunday was our day, and her voice had a brightness in it that was doing work. The mortgage rate had adjusted. They were short. Just a bridge, she said, just until Nathan's commission cycle caught up. I wrote a check for $11,000. There was no repayment schedule. It felt obscene to draw one up. You don't paper a contract against your own child. That's not how families work. That's not how love works. And if you'd asked me then, I'd have told you that a father who asks for a promissory note from his daughter has already lost something more valuable than $11,000. That was my first mistake. Not the money, the reasoning. I had constructed a philosophy that made it impossible for me to ever say no. And then I had congratulated myself on my generosity, when in fact I had simply built a door with no lock on it and called the absence of a lock a virtue. Over the next 5 years the calls kept coming, and they came with a rhythm I could have graphed. A roof. Tyler's braces, that's my grandson, 12 now, a gap-toothed grin I would step in front of a truck for. Preschool tuition for Sophie, a transmission. Nathan's mother's funeral expenses, which I paid in full and learned 2 years later his brother had already covered. I am not keeping a ledger, but if I were, it would come to something in the neighborhood of $64,000. And not one of those dollars ever came back, and not once, not a single time in 5 years, did anyone raise the subject of it coming back. There was never a conversation. There was only an expectation and my compliance, and the two of them fit together so smoothly that neither party ever had to acknowledge the machine was running. But numbers are a poor way to tell you what actually happened, because what actually happened wasn't financial. What happened was that Claire stopped asking how I was. I want you to understand the exact texture of that, because it's the whole story, really. She didn't stop calling. She called more, if anything. But somewhere in the 3rd year, the calls changed shape. They developed an agenda. There was a warm part at the beginning. How are you, Dad? Are you eating? And then a hinge, an almost audible click, and then the reason. And after a while, I learned to hear the click coming. And after a while longer, I stopped listening to the warm part at all. Because I knew it was scaffolding. And you don't admire scaffolding, you just wait for it to come down so you can see what's actually being built. She stopped coming over just to sit. That was the thing. That was the thing I would have traded the whole $64,000 back for, and would have thrown in the pension. I told myself this was love. I told myself this is what fathers are for, this is what Margaret would have wanted, that a man who counts what he gives his children isn't giving, he's lending. And I hadn't raised a daughter in order to become her creditor. And here is what I have learned about telling yourself stories. You get so good at it that you stop being able to hear the truth underneath, even when the truth is standing in your driveway, saying it out loud, at a volume you could measure. It was an evening in September. The kitchen window was open because Margaret always left it open in September, and I had never stopped. I was washing dishes. Nathan had come by to pick up a ladder and was standing beside his car in my driveway, on the phone, not knowing sound travels. "We just need to keep the old man feeling useful," he said. And then he laughed, not cruelly. "That's the thing I need you to understand." There was no cruelty in it at all. It was the easy laugh of a man discussing a manageable logistical matter. And he said, "You know how he gets. You know how he gets." I finished the dishes. I dried them and put them away and wiped the counter and hung the towel on its hook. And I did not say a word, not that night, not for 3 years, and my hands did not shake, and that frightened me more than anything. Because you know how he gets is a sentence about a man who has already been discussed, repeatedly, in rooms I wasn't in. It meant there was a version of me that existed in my daughter's household, a character, a variable to be managed, an old man with predictable settings, and my daughter had sat in those rooms and heard that sentence, and had not, at any point, said, "That's my father." Don't. That was the night I understood. I had been dead for some time and simply hadn't been informed. I would like to tell you that I acted on that immediately. I did not. I did nothing at all for 4 months, because knowing a thing and being able to move under the weight of it are different skills, and I only had the first one. What moved me was a box. In January, I finally cleaned out the closet in the spare bedroom, the one that had been Margaret's sewing room, and had become in the 6 years since a place where I put things I couldn't look at. There was a box on the top shelf with her handwriting on the lid, W, eventually, which is the most infuriatingly patient thing my wife ever wrote, because eventually meant she knew it would take me years, and she had decided in advance to forgive me for it. Inside were the things you'd expect: photographs, our marriage certificate, a recipe card in her mother's hand, and an envelope with my name on it, sealed, written in the loose, unsteady script of the last months, when the pen had gotten heavy. I sat down on the floor of that closet, and I did not open it for a long time. I won't give you the whole letter. Some things belong to the man they were written to, but there is a passage I have read so many times I could recite it in my sleep, and I want to read it to you, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. She wrote, "You give things away, Walter. It's the best thing about you, and it's the thing I'm most afraid of. You give because you're terrified that if you ever stopped, you'd find out what people actually wanted you for. I've watched you do it your whole life, and I never said anything because it was aimed at me, and it felt like being loved. But I won't be there to aim it at. Please be careful who you hand yourself to. You're not an inheritance. You're a person, and I'd like you to try being one for a while." She had known. 26 years of 5-year-olds had made my wife a diagnostician of the human heart, and she had looked at me across 31 years of breakfasts and seen straight down to the bottom of me. And she had loved me anyway, and, this is the part that undid me on that closet floor, she had chosen to tell me only when she could no longer be accused of wanting something from the telling. You're not an inheritance. I sat there until the light went out of the window, and when I got up, I was, in some way I still cannot fully articulate, a different man. Not a braver one, just one who had run out of stories to tell himself. The next morning I called a financial advisor. Her name was Diane Whitmore. She worked out of a 2-room office above a bakery in Brookside, so that her entire practice smelled permanently of bread, which I have decided is the correct atmosphere in which to discuss money. She had close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses she was forever misplacing, and a way of talking about capital that made it sound like she was talking about something much more important. Which she was. I told her everything, the loans that weren't, the click in the middle of the phone calls, the driveway, the letter. It took 2 hours and I did not once look at her while I did it. I looked at a water stain on her ceiling, shaped vaguely like Michigan. When I finished, she put down her pen. She didn't offer condolences. She didn't tell me it wasn't my fault. She said, "Walter, what do you want the rest of your life to look like?" I opened my mouth and discovered there was nothing in it. Nobody had asked me that in, I did the arithmetic later, 19 years. Not since Margaret asked it in a Denny's in 1987 at 2 in the morning, when we were young and broke and stupid and had ordered coffee we couldn't afford, and she'd pulled a napkin out of the dispenser and written Portugal at the top and handed me the pen. I told Diane I'd need to think about it. She said, take all the time you want. I took 3 weeks. What I came back with was not sophisticated. I wanted to travel. I wanted to see the things on a napkin that had lived in my dresser drawer for 35 years, while I attended to other people's drainage. I wanted to wake up on a Tuesday without the low animal dread of what the phone might ask of me. I wanted, for whatever was left, to be the subject of my own sentences instead of the object of everyone else's. Diane restructured everything, and I'm going to spare you the mechanics because they're dull and they're not the point. The shape of it was this: a revocable living trust. The house, a 3-bedroom colonial in Maple Grove I'd owned free and clear since 2019, went into it. The investments got rebuilt around income rather than legacy, and a meaningful portion of the estate was designated to the Cedar Falls Community Arts Foundation, which puts music and drawing back into elementary schools that have had them cut, and which Margaret volunteered with every single summer she was alive, and which had sent 41 people to her funeral. I did not disinherit my daughter. I need to be precise about this, because in the retellings that have made their way back to me, I am a vengeful old man who cut his child off, and that is not what happened, and it matters to me that you know it. Claire was left something real, substantial even. What she was not left was everything, automatically, by default, by gravity, without ever having to ask herself whether she wanted it or wanted me. The plan was never to punish anyone. The plan was to stop being a thing that other people were waiting for. My attorney drew up the papers. Gerald Foster, an office on Main, a handshake like a closing argument, 40 years of my family's business, and a man who had carried my wife's casket. He read everything twice the way he does, and then he took his glasses off and said, "You understand this changes things." I know. You ready for that? I thought about a box on a closet shelf. I've been ready for 6 years, I said. I just didn't know the word for it. I want to add one thing here, out of order, because I only learned it much later, and it changes the shape of everything. In that same period, the 3 years I spent quietly rebuilding my life, Claire was fighting Nathan about me. Not successfully, not loudly. But there was a night, she told me eventually, when he came home from my house after some errand, and said something about how the old man's sitting on 400 grand doing nothing with it. And Claire told him to never speak about her father that way again. And he apologized the way he apologizes, which is a technique rather than an act. And she went into the bathroom and ran the water so the children wouldn't hear her. And she had a savings account he didn't know about. $1,100, put away 40 at a time over 6 years, which she could not have explained the purpose of, if you'd asked her. She just knew that a woman should have something in the world with only her name on it. She never told me any of this at the time. I want to be honest. Knowing it now doesn't erase the 5 years. But it does mean that the story I'd been telling myself, that my daughter had simply become someone else, was wrong. She hadn't become someone else. She'd become someone smaller, incrementally, in a house where the available air was being used by another person. And she had fought for herself in the only currency she had left, which was $40 at a time, and the sound of a running faucet. That's not innocence. She let it happen. But it isn't villainy either. And I have had to learn to hold both of those in the same hand, which is the hardest physical act I have ever performed. There is one more thing I didn't know then, and it explains the tempo of what came next. Nathan was drowning. Not in the way he presented it, the commission cycle, the seasonal dip, the temporary compression that a man of his caliber routinely weathers. 2 years before my retirement, he had put a substantial amount of money, most of it not his, into a partnership stake in a regional agency that was supposed to double it. It was not a scam. It was worse than a scam. It was a legitimate business that simply failed, slowly in the ordinary way, taking 18 months to do it. By the spring of my retirement, He was carrying something like $190,000 of personal debt against an income that could not service it. And he had told his wife almost none of the true number. I found this out later. Gerald found it, actually, in the course of other business. And when I learned it, I felt, I am going to be honest with you, even though it does me no credit, I felt vindicated for about 4 seconds, and then I felt sick for about 4 months. Because it meant that the man in my driveway was not a predator calmly harvesting an old man. He was a person falling in the dark with his hand out, and the nearest solid object was me, and he had convinced himself that grabbing me was a family value. That doesn't excuse it. Let me be very clear, because I know how these stories get flattened. It does not excuse it. A drowning man is entitled to reach for you. He is not entitled to lie to his wife about the water, or to teach his children that their grandfather is a resource, or to sit at a table with balloons over his head and try to take a house from a man who has just been handed a plaque. But it did dissolve something I had been enjoying, which was the belief that I was surrounded by monsters. I wasn't. I was surrounded by frightened people who had found it easier to reorganize their morality than to say the words, "I am in trouble, and I don't know what to do." And I had made that easy for them. For 5 years I had made it very, very easy. The party was Claire's idea. She called it a celebration, and I believed her. And I want to say this plainly because I know some of you are ahead of me and shouting at your screens. I believed her. I believed the enthusiasm in her voice. I believed the texts about whether I wanted sheet cake or tiered. I believed her because she was my daughter, and because belief is not a decision you make, it is a place you live. And I had lived there her whole life. I believed it even when Nathan emailed me, emailed not called, to ask whether we might find a moment during the evening to talk about the future. I said sure, of course, that sounds fine. They held it in the event room at the Riverside Grand, 60-some people, most of them mine. Engineers I'd worked beside for 3 decades, 2 neighbors, a woman from Public Works who cried during her own toast, and my friend Frank Delaney from the Thursday poker game, 70 years old, sitting in the corner with a plate of shrimp cocktail, watching the room the way Frank watches everything, which is completely. I shook hands, I accepted toasts, I ate the chicken, which was fine, and I waited. Nathan gave a speech. It was good. It was, I want to be fair, genuinely good, warm, well-structured, 3 laughs and a lump in the throat, and if you did not know what you were listening to, you would have thought a son-in-law loved his wife's father very much. He thanked me for my service to the community. He said I was an example to all of us. He said he hoped I was ready for the next chapter. He made a joke about how I'd finally have time to fix my gutters, and 60 people laughed, and I laughed too. Because the gutters were fine, I'd done them in April, and because a man should laugh at a joke made in his honor. Then Claire stood up. She said she loved me. She said she was grateful for everything I'd done for her and for the children. Her voice caught, and it caught in the real place. I know my daughter's throat the way I know my own hands. And then, she said she hoped that going forward we could all support each other, because family means showing up for each other in real, practical ways. Real, practical ways. I have turned that sentence over more times than I can count, and here is what I found in it. It wasn't hers. The rhythm was wrong. Claire doesn't build sentences with 2 adjectives in front of the noun. Nobody in my family has ever said practical in a room with balloons in it. I looked at Nathan while she said it, and he was watching her the way a director watches an actor land a line. She sat down. There was applause, and then Nathan leaned across the table, and his voice dropped into the register menus, when they want you to feel that you are simply 2 reasonable people having a reasonable conversation, and he said, "So, Wally," he smiled, 11 years and he had never once gotten my name right, not really. Nobody had called me Wally since 1974. The house. We've been thinking, with the kids getting bigger and our place getting tight, that it might make sense to talk about whether there's a path where we could. Nathan, I said. He stopped. I sold the house. I have lived a quiet life, and I am not a man who takes pleasure in the pain of others, and I am not going to pretend to you that I felt nothing. I felt something. God help me, I felt something. His face did three things in about a second and a half, and I watched all three. First, confusion, the reflexive smile still running on its own momentum, like a car with the engine off. Then recalculation, fast, visible, the eyes going somewhere behind themselves. And then the third thing, the one I'd never seen on him and have never seen since. The specific naked expression of a man who has just discovered that a door he has been walking toward for years, planning around, borrowing against, counting on, has been sealed from the other side. And was sealed some time ago, and he was never told, because nobody thought to tell him. Because he was never actually a party to it. You, Claire said. Dad. What? I sold the house. Closed in March. I've been renting a 2-bedroom on Elm Street in Brookside. Walking distance to the good bakery. You know how I feel about that bakery. March, she said. That was Dad. That was 5 months ago. You've been, she stopped. I watched her understand the size of the silence. 5 months of Sunday phone calls. 5 months of how are you, Dad? And not once had the conversation gone anywhere near the shape of my actual life, because the warm part had never been about my actual life. And she was, at that exact moment, at a table with a cake on it, working that out for herself. I've also restructured the investments, I said. My voice stayed level. I kept my hands flat on the tablecloth. I had practiced this in a car, which I'm not proud of. And there's a charitable trust in your mother's name through the Arts Foundation. A meaningful portion of the estate goes there when I'm gone. I looked at my daughter, only at her. I've left you something, Claire, something real. It just isn't what Nathan was about to ask for. The room had not stopped. That's the thing nobody tells you about the big moments they happen inside a party. Somewhere behind me, a man from Public Works was telling a story about a culvert. Across the room, Frank Delaney had set down his shrimp and was watching us with the total, unembarrassed attention of a man who has lived long enough to know a hinge when he sees one swing. Claire's eyes filled. Dad, I didn't. I just wanted. I know what you wanted, I said, and I need you to hear how I said it, because this is the only part of that night I'd defend to God. I didn't say it hard. I said it the way you say something you have been carrying for years. At the moment you finally set it down, gently, and a little out of breath, because the weight had been mine, and I had never once asked her to help me hold it. I know what you both wanted, and I love you. I love those kids more than anything I have ever known except your mother. But I'm 62 years old, and there's a napkin in my dresser drawer that your mother and I wrote on in a Denny's in 1987. And there are 11 things on it, and I have done none of them, and I am going to go do them now. That's all this is. That's the whole thing. Nathan pushed back his chair. He did not say another word to me that night. On the drive home, I called Frank from the car. I saw that, he said before I could speak. How was the shrimp? Outstanding. A pause. You doing okay? The night air was cool for May. Somewhere out on the Cedar Falls streets, a dog was barking at something it was never going to reach. I thought about it honestly, because Frank is not a man you perform for. Yeah, I said. I actually am. The calls started 4 days later, not from Claire. From Nathan, which tells you better than anything I could say, who was actually driving. He called twice on a Thursday morning. I let both go. The voicemails were careful, measured, beautifully modulated, the work of a man who talks for a living. He thought there had been a misunderstanding. He and Claire wanted to clear the air. He hoped I knew that nothing was meant the way it might have seemed. The it was never specified. It never is. That's the technique. Claire called Friday evening and I picked that one up. She cried. Real crying. I know my daughter. I know the difference. I have known the difference since she was 4 years old. and learned that the other kind worked on me. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't known what Nathan was going to say. I believe that's partly true. I think she knew more than she was letting herself know, which is the particular arrangement we make when we love someone whose choices we have quietly agreed not to examine. It isn't lying, it's worse in a way. It's subcontracting your conscience. Daddy, she said. She hadn't called me that in probably 15 years. I don't care about the house. I don't. I just want things to be okay between us. Things can be okay between us, I said. They can be better than okay. But they have to be different. Do you understand what I mean by that? A long pause. Long enough that I heard a door close on her end, and I understood she had walked into another room. Yeah, she said. I do. I meant it. I want that on the record, because a story like this gets compressed in the telling and I come out sounding like a man who won. I wasn't trying to exile my daughter from my life. I was trying to have one. Those are not the same project, and I had spent 6 years confusing them. Then in June it got ugly, not loudly. It never gets loudly ugly with men like Nathan. Gerald called me on a Tuesday, of course it was a Tuesday, and told me he'd heard from an attorney representing my son-in-law. Just a courtesy call, he said. Just some questions about the timeline of the trust. 3 weeks later, the courtesy call became a letter. The letter used the phrase testamentary capacity and the phrase undue influence, and requested in the tone of a man doing you a favor that I voluntarily produce medical records going back 4 years. Sit with that for a moment, because I want you to feel the exact shape of it, the way I felt it standing in my kitchen in Brookside, holding 2 pieces of paper. The implication was not that I had been wronged. The implication was that I was not there, that the man who had spent 34 years calculating load tolerances for the bridges their children drove over had at some unspecified point simply gone, and that a woman named Diane Whitmore above a bakery had steered the vacated body toward a charity. The implication was that there was no version of events in which Walter Bergman, in full possession of himself, having thought about it for 3 years, having read a letter from his dying wife on a closet floor, would freely choose this. Therefore he must be gone. Therefore find the paperwork that proves he's gone. It was, and I have had years to find a better word and cannot, the purest thing Nathan ever said to me. Everything else had been technique. This was the thesis. The old man is not a person who decides. There was a meeting. I insisted on it over Gerald's objection. Conference room, downtown, a July morning, the air conditioning up too high. Gerald on my left. Nathan's attorney across the table, a young man with a good suit, and I'll say this for him, visible discomfort. Nathan beside him. Claire was not there. Claire had not been told about the meeting at all, and when she found out about it 3 weeks later, that was the thing that broke it. Not the party, not the money. The fact that her husband had retained counsel against her father and had decided she didn't need to know. The young attorney began. He was maybe 6 sentences into a paragraph about my vulnerability during a period of profound grief when I put my hand on Gerald's arm. And Gerald, who has known me 40 years and has never once let me talk when talking would cost me, looked at my face and, to his eternal credit, sat back. I said, Nathan, look at me. He did, I'll give him that. You've known me 11 years, I said. In 11 years, how many times have you asked me a question about myself? The room went very still. That's not, the attorney started. I'm not asking him a legal question. I'm asking him a question. I kept my eyes on Nathan. 11 years, every Christmas, every birthday, every one of those Sunday dinners. How many times? He didn't answer. He looked at the table. And here is the thing that has stayed with me and has, in some way I'm still working out, made forgiveness possible. He wasn't being defiant. He was counting. I watched him actually go back and look, and I watched him arrive at the number, and I watched him understand that I already knew the number, and that we were both now sitting in a room with it. I'm not gone, I said. I want you to understand that. I'm not confused, I'm not being managed, and I'm not gone. I've been here the entire time, that was the problem. Gerald handled the rest. Gerald is very good at his job. He produced the file, 3 years of correspondence, contemporaneous notes, a cognitive assessment I'd taken voluntarily 2 years earlier at Diane's suggestion, because she'd said someday someone will ask. And I want the answer to already exist, and a letter from my physician of 19 years that I have never read all the way through, because Gerald told me it made him emotional, and Gerald does not get emotional. The whole thing died in 9 days. I was in Lisbon when I found out, sitting at a cafe near the water with a pastel de nata and a coffee, watching a river do what rivers do, and my phone buzzed against the metal table. All quiet. Enjoy your trip, G. I put the phone in my pocket. I ordered another coffee. I sat there for a long time and I did not feel triumphant, which surprised me. I felt the way you feel when a fever finally breaks. Not good, just emptied and aware of the shape of the room again. I came home in August. Claire came to the apartment on a Sunday, not with a request, not with a warm part and a click. She just came and she brought 2 coffees, and we sat at my kitchen table with the good light coming in, and she cried and I let her. And then we talked about her mother for the first time in 6 years. Really talked. The way we used to before Nathan's voice began occupying all the available space in every room he was in. She told me about the $1,100. She told me about the night she ran the bathroom faucet. She told me she had found out about the lawyer from a bank statement, and that she had sat in her car in a grocery store parking lot for 50 minutes, and that when she came home she had said to her husband, "You will never speak to a lawyer about my father again. And you will never say the words, 'the house,' in my presence for the rest of your life." He agreed. He agreed immediately, which she said was somehow the worst part, because it meant it had always been available to her. All those years it had been sitting right there, one sentence away, and she had simply never picked it up. I thought if I said no to him he'd, she stopped. Leave. Get smallish, she said. I thought he'd get smaller and then I'd have to look at what was left. I did not say me too, I didn't have to. It sat down at the table between us and had a cup of coffee. The hardest thing, though, came from a 12-year-old. It was September. Tyler was at my apartment for the afternoon, while Claire took Sophie to a birthday party. And we had built about $400 of unnecessary model rocket on my kitchen table, and he had gone quiet for a while, which is not his mode. Then he said, without looking up, "Grandpa, do you still love us if we don't get your house? I want you to understand something. Nothing in 34 years of engineering, nothing in 14 months of watching my wife die, nothing in that conference room in July has ever hit me the way those 11 words did." He wasn't accusing me. That's what took the floor out. He was asking sincerely, the way you'd ask whether it was going to rain. Because somewhere in that house, in a room he wasn't supposed to be listening in, a 12-year-old had absorbed the arithmetic. That there was a house, and it was connected to Grandpa, and now the house was gone. And therefore, something about Grandpa had probably also changed, because that's how the adults had been talking about it. And children are the finest instruments we have ever built for measuring what adults actually mean. They had taught my grandson that love and property are the same substance in different states. I put down the rocket fin. My hands were not steady, which I noticed with a kind of distant relief. 6 years earlier they hadn't shaken at all, in a kitchen, with a window open, and that had been the sickest I'd ever been. "Tyler," I said, "look at me." He looked up. "There was never a house," I said. "Not really, there was a building." Buildings are they're materials. They're what's left over after somebody's finished loving somebody. Your grandmother and I loved each other inside that one for a while. And then she died, and it was just lumber. I was doing it badly. I kept going anyway. The reason I want you here is you. There's no other reason. There was never another reason. There's nothing you could ever be given or not given that would change one single thing about how I feel when you walk into a room. He thought about it, and then he said, "Okay," and picked the fin back up, because he was 12 and it was Tuesday, and the rocket wasn't going to build itself. But then, about 10 minutes later, without looking up from the glue, he said, "Dad said you were mad at us." And that right there, that is why I'm telling you all of this, instead of just quietly going to the Rockies. Because that's how it moves. That's how it gets into the next generation. Not through a will, not through a lawsuit. Through a sentence said in a kitchen by a tired man who needs the story to be about someone else's anger instead of his own hand. I said, "I'm not mad at you. I've never been mad at you, not for 1 second of your entire life." And then I said the hardest true thing I could find, because he deserved a true thing, and I was out of easy ones. I got mad at some grown-ups. That's a thing grown-ups have to do sometimes, and it's not your job to fix it or to carry it. Your only job is to build this rocket badly with me and eat too much of my ice cream, deal? Deal. He is 13 now. He asked me last month if I thought his rocket drawing was realistic, and I told him that with the right education anything is possible. And I meant every word. And he ran off to show his sister, and I sat there in my daughter's living room, feeling something I had not felt in a very long time. Like a man who had gotten one thing right. I've been to 5 places on that napkin now. Portugal. The Outer Banks, which Margaret always called the real beach. Jackson Hole in September, which was everything. Prince Edward Island, where nobody tried to sell me anything, which at this point in my life I consider the highest available form of hospitality. And in October, I'm going to the Rockies. And Frank Delaney is coming, 71 years old, with a knee that has no business on a mountain and an absolute refusal to adjust his expectations accordingly, which I find one of the most admirable qualities in a human being I have ever encountered. 6 items left. I'll get to them, or I won't. But I want to tell you about something that has mattered more than any of it, because I suspect it's the actual reason you're still here. I started volunteering with the Arts Foundation. Not out of nobility, out of cowardice, honestly. I had money going to a place, and I didn't want to be a name on a check the way I'd been a name on a check for 5 years to my own family. So I showed up on a Thursday to help move some donated pianos, and I never really stopped showing up. And I found something there I was not looking for. There is a woman named Ruth, 76, who deeded her farm to a son who sold it inside of a year. There is a man named Errol, a retired postal supervisor, who co-signed a loan for a nephew he loves and who now works part-time at a hardware store at 69 years old. There is a woman named Marisol who spent 11 years supporting a daughter's household and who told me, over paper cups of coffee in an elementary school gymnasium, that the moment she finally said no, her daughter looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. And that expression was surprise. And that surprise was the whole indictment. 22 years of motherhood, and the shocking thing was the word no. Nobody had told me, that's the thing. There are millions of us and not one of us had been told, because there is no vocabulary for it, and no ritual, and no card in the store. We are simply expected to know how to be old and generous and not eaten, and we get no instruction whatsoever, and so we improvise, and most of us improvise badly. And then we sit in a gymnasium at 62 with a paper cup and find out we were never alone. We were just quiet in parallel. So here is what I have after all of it. Not lessons, I distrust lessons. Call them findings from a man who spent his career finding out where water goes. The first is that generosity without a floor is not generosity. It's abdication wearing generosity's coat. I gave for 5 years and I called it love. And it was not love, it was fear. The exact fear my wife named in a letter I was too much of a coward to be given while she was alive. I was afraid that if I ever stopped producing, I'd find out what I was actually worth to the people I'd built my life around. So I never stopped, and I never found out, and the not finding out cost me the very thing I was protecting. You cannot buy immunity from a question. You can only pay the installments forever. The second is that the people who love you do not need you to be useful. They just need you to be there, and the people who need you to be useful will call that love. And here's the part that took me 62 years and a conference room in July to understand. They will believe it themselves. Nathan is not a con man. Nathan is a frightened person who reorganized his morality around a need and did it so smoothly he never once had to notice he'd done it. That's not rare. That's Tuesday. That's most of us on our worst years. The third is about the word no, and it's the one I'd tattoo on a young person if they'd hold still. No is not the opposite of love. No is the fence that makes love mean something, because a yes that was never capable of being a no isn't a yes at all. It's just weather. It's just what happens. For 5 years, my daughter never received a single gift from me, not one, because a gift requires a giver who could have declined and chose not to, and I had made myself constitutionally incapable of declining. I gave her $64,000 and 0 gifts. I have thought about that until it stopped hurting and started being useful. The fourth is that you can forgive someone and still not hand them the keys. This one nearly broke me, because I was raised to believe forgiveness meant restoration, that if you truly forgave, the relationship went back to how it was, and anything less was spite in a nice sweater. That's wrong. That's a doctrine invented by people who benefit from it. Forgiveness is putting down the desire for someone to suffer. It is not the resumption of access. I am polite to Nathan. I will be polite to Nathan at family events for the rest of my life, and never more than that, and I have made a peace with that which is not resignation, but something closer to accuracy. And the last one is for the people my age, and I'm going to say it directly because I'm too old to be graceful about it. Your children are not a retirement plan, and you are not one either. Somewhere along the way we made an arrangement where the old are supposed to spend the last chapter converting themselves into an inheritance, smaller and smaller, quieter and quieter, until the useful part is all that's left and it can be distributed. I did that for 6 years and I was good at it and it nearly finished me. Margaret wrote, "You're not an inheritance. You're a person, and I'd like you to try being one for a while." I'm trying, sweetheart. It's going all right. Things with Claire are better. Slowly, imperfectly, genuinely better. Which is the only kind of better that counts, because the other kind is a story people tell at a party. She hasn't asked me about money since the night of the cake. Not once. What she asks about now is Portugal, and whether the knee is going to survive the Rockies, and whether I've eaten. And she asks it without a click in the middle. And I have learned to hear the absence of the click, the way you learn to hear a house settle. We are not what we were before Nathan. I want to be honest with you about that, because I owe you honesty more than I owe you a tidy ending. Something was spent. You cannot run $64,000 and 5 years of Tuesdays through a relationship and come out the other side with the original article. What you get instead is a second thing, built on the site of the first, and it is smaller and stranger. And I did not expect this, more solid, because for the first time in her adult life, my daughter is in a room with me for no reason. There's a napkin in the top drawer of my dresser. Her mother's handwriting on one side, mine on the other. It's brittle now. I've had to put it in a plastic sleeve, which Margaret would have found hysterical. 6 items left. I'm going to get to all of them. If you've stayed with me this long, and I know exactly how long it's been, I'm not unaware, thank you. That's not a formality. Somewhere out there is a man washing dishes with his kitchen window open, and a woman with $1,100 in an account nobody knows about. And if this landed anywhere near you, I'd be glad if you subscribed to my channel and stayed a while. Tell me in the comments what's on your napkin. I read them. I read all of them, which my daughter says is unwise at my age, and she's probably right, and I'm going to keep doing it. Everything you've heard was written by a person, an actual one, with a name and an address and reading glasses he keeps losing. I wrote it in longhand first, the way I've written everything since 1981, and then typed it badly. I've been asked why I don't let a machine tidy these up. Here's my answer. A machine can produce a sentence about a man washing dishes while his son-in-law calls him the old man in the driveway. It can probably produce a better one than I just did. What it cannot do is stand at that sink. It has never had a wife who took the smaller half for 31 years, or a grandson who asked whether love survives a real estate transaction. And I don't think you can write the sentence without having stood there, or if you can, I don't think it's worth reading. I've changed the names, all of them, including my own, and the town and the street. The people in this story are still living their lives, and some of them are children, and they did not agree to be characters. What happened, happened. How I've told it is mine, and it is my version, and my daughter would tell parts of it differently, and she'd be right about some of them. If you're sitting with a phone that rings on Tuesdays, you're allowed. You're allowed to say the word. It doesn't mean you failed them, and it doesn't mean you stopped. It just means you're still in there. Take care of yourselves.